All systems go. Clear for liftoff. What's up, everyone? Tyler Tamboline here, aka ToeTagginTambo, back for another edition of Leverage Lane. We got Week 10 NFL DFS. Going to be breaking all things down when it comes to ownership. Maybe not in the way you always hear it. We've had some interesting takes even pre-show to go through this. You'll definitely want to stick around for that as it affects single entry. Our focus is, as usual, on GPPs, but at a single entry up process, so you guys can put it together for 3 max, 20 max, extrapolate out from there. Stage 2 of Leverage Lane, going down the lane, is we're going to get to the common build, how it all fits together, what people are doing, and look for ways to leverage that. And then at the very end, Alex and myself will take all the information we've got throughout the show to go with our Leverage Lane. And Alex, I'll kick it over to you, man. I will say this, Utica won the 555 millimaker last week with a quad stack. So we were on the right track when it came to that. But what was your thoughts on last week? We'll recap it a little bit first. And how you doing this week, my friend? Week 10, we made it.
Yeah, I was kind of bummed with that slate. I had a triple stack with Daniel Jones, and my thought kind of going in was, if they finally have a week where Jonathan Taylor doesn't score multiple touchdowns, this Daniel Jones stack is going off, and it actually did pretty well. Even triple stacks worked if you had Downs instead of Tyler Warren, but instead of them producing the same amount that they had been producing, it was just they scored multiple touchdowns fewer than they had been scoring. So it was a solid week. It wasn't a great week, but I really, really like this slate ahead of us.
Yeah, it's a good one. Going to do a couple of quick things first. Just one promotion we got just started this week, and so I want to get it out there fast because we're giving away a 555 millimaker ticket. So if you guys want to get the rest of the NFL season, it includes college football, whether you need it or not, or it's valid in your state or whatever or not, but you do get Ship It Games entry for the rest of the season. We're giving away over $50,000 in cash to the Ship It Nation community, 27,000 plus in prizes, thanks to our partners over at SaberSim. You get all the tools, projections, ownership, etc. And then you get in a draw. Anybody who gets the $199 deal, and a lot have taken advantage so far, you do get in a draw for a 555 millimaker ticket on top of that. So that's the promotion for this week. If you just want to check things out and the whole thing is not for you yet, then you can get in for $19 with Ship 19. Alex, I want to do what we usually do and just go through some of the positions and look at sort of what we're seeing. I think we got some interesting thoughts right here, right away, especially as it pertains to single entry, where things typically spread out a little bit further. And I shouldn't say spread out, actually opposite, where you will see more of a, let's say, popular running back in the $20 millimaker, where we're getting most ownership for that, will start to get much higher owned, or projected higher owned, which is the key word there when you get to looking at the single entry, higher dollar, smaller field stuff. So what are you sort of seeing right now when it comes to some of the positional stuff?
Yeah, I think the first thing I'll say is, like, this is a more spread out week of ownership than a lot of the weeks that we've had in the last month or so. So that part of it is nice. I think the only guy that I have at 40%, and again, this is the first week in at least a month where only one guy has been projected over 40% for us in single entries. That's Rico Dowdle at 6,300 against the Saints. I think that it's probably still good chalk just because he seems like a very true bell cow now, and it's going to be really difficult for the game script to not go his way. Like, that's, he's the type of running back who by far, like, the number one way he fails is that the game script gets out of hand and he just doesn't get the touches. He doesn't get the touchdowns. But against New Orleans and that inept offense, that seems like a really unlikely outcome. So I think he's pretty good chalk, but certainly not a lock for me. And then beyond that, you got McCaffrey, 33.6%. That's the lowest he's been. You have a very, very spread out wide receiver, especially like upper echelon of wide receivers. Smith and Jigba, Puka, Amon-Ra St. Brown, all kind of stealing from each other. And then you do have one mid-tier wide receiver who looks like he's going to be very popular in Zay Flowers. I'm kind of curious your thoughts there, because this is not the first time we have seen Zay project for massive ownership around the industry. The last time we had Lamar ruled out on, I think it was either Saturday or maybe even Sunday morning. And Zay still ended up like 25% with Huntley. So that surprised me. It makes me think that there's actually like a real floor to his ownership this week against Minnesota.
His seems legit to me. Like there's one that doesn't seem legit, which we'll get to in a little bit. I think we might save that for segment 2. I think a lot of people think one thing, and then I actually think it's the opposite. Both of us only get to talk 5 minutes or so pre-show, but it was funny. You just asked the question and I answered it, and we ended up being on the same page. But with Zay, I think you nailed it with that statement. I remember it because we talked about it as with like a if this, then that type scenario on a Saturday about what would happen if Lamar was actually ruled out. And then it ended up that he was. They gave him one more week to get through to the Thursday night football game or whatever it was against Miami. So that was a week where you saw what happens with Zay ownership based off of that. It still kind of was there. This week, he's, in single entry at just $5,900. I think there's enough people on Lamar and enough willing to go to, again, not like it's going to be high owned, but willing to at least consider JJ McCarthy after what they saw last week to say, okay, he's going to be in the mix somehow. What's your thoughts, Sol? Because you always have a good, sort of thought process around this stuff. Is Zay as a one-off?
I'm definitely not interested in it. I think there are worse one-offs. So the main concern that I have here is if he has a huge game, it's just too likely that he's bringing Lamar Jackson with him because of what Lamar does with his legs as well. And because Lamar isn't 2% owned, he's probably going to be, 8, 9, 10, something like that. That's just a little bit more competition than what I'd like from one-off wide receiver. Now, he's at least somebody who he can get there on receptions and yards alone. He's very touchdown independent, even though, like, obviously, if he gives you 35 this week instead of 25, it's because he scored once or twice. Whereas typically, his 20, 22-point performance is just coming on yardage and receptions. So the ceiling is still going to bring Lamar with him. And that's why I'm probably not on him. The one way I might play him is if you just flip the build and you said, okay, what if it's Minnesota instead? What if it's McCarthy, Jefferson, Addison, and then I'll bring it back with Zay and maybe Derrick Henry. And now I'm telling the story of Baltimore puts up a lot of points, and it's because they move the ball in chunks with Flowers and maybe Henry gets a long one. But when they get to the red zone, it's Derrick Henry punching it in. He has a 3-touchdown game. Zay has 150 receiving yards, and then McCarthy ends up outscoring Lamar Jackson that way. So that's the kind of lineup that I would really consider him in. But other than that, I'm not going to use him as a one-off.
I like, there was a little Isaiah joke in there where he said it's with Zay Flowers, it's too likely that this, so yeah, it could be a Lamar with Zay with likely, but I like to talk about flipping the build. We'll get to that later when we talk about how to leverage the common build, but that's a spot where it's like, even with JJ McCarthy, who you mentioned, he doesn't have to raw points outscore Lamar. It's a slate where we're a little bit starved for value at some stuff, or I'm seeing people forcing the sort of mid-range wide receivers outside of Zay. There is some other options there that I think would be a little bit more fragile, where, like you said, he could just get there on 6 for 130 or something like that, and it still counts. But the other thing that's interesting too, and it's all slate dynamics, is think back to the week of Rashee Rice at 5,600. He was $300 less. He was super chalk for a reason. He actually did get 2 touchdowns. He was still not on winners. He was on some of the stuff in the smaller field stuff, but overall still wasn't required because it was 30-point scores out there. And maybe that's a thought for this slate as well, but it's not like we see, or at least I don't, I'm a huge Ravens fan. I don't see Zay getting to like 8K anytime soon versus Rice. You were like, well, he's going to be 7,500 plus next week, probably, if he has a good game this week at 5,600, and he did. And then we saw that. So there is some dynamics to that. The one thing you mentioned there too, that I think stands true, just going to it here, looking at it, quarterback, you've got sort of the ranges, right? You've got the Lamar, Josh Allen, maybe even lump Drake Allen in there, where people are, Drake May, Josh Allen, similar, Drake May in there. But then after that, it's kind of cheaper guys, right? Like you're seeing, like you said, maybe, and it's not like they have huge ownership because it's so spread out, 5 to 7%ers, whether people are choosing Darnold or they're choosing Mac Jones, they're looking at JJ McCarthy, Mariota, whatever it might be across different sites. Is there anything else at quarterback that makes you think could change as we get to the single entry stuff and diving into what the build looks like?
Yeah, I actually do think I have a different read on quarterback ownership this week than most of the industry. Obviously, like Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson are projecting as popular around the industry. And it's not that I think that they won't be. I just think the typical build is not going to be one of those two. The typical build is going to be paying down at quarterback. So McCarthy, Jacoby Brissett, Jackson Dart, Mac Jones, I think that's kind of the foundation that people are going to like a little bit more, just because it gives you that easier access to McCaffrey, Smith and Jigba, right? Like Smith and Jigba fits perfectly as a bring back to Jacoby Brissett. So that's one factor. Like I think I'm probably the highest in the industry on Brissett's ownership, and that's one of the main reasons why. It's because there's a very clear and obvious way to use one of the studs that everyone wants to use within that stack, that game stack. So I think people are going to do that a little bit more often because, as you said, we're a little bit starved for value. And so how do people get value that they actually feel a little bit good about? They turn to the stack for it. They feel like, okay, if none of the value that I use is going to be good, I can at least correlate the value that I use, which is smart. I certainly don't think it's wrong to build this way, but I do think it's going to be a little bit more popular. At least the structure is going to be more popular than what people think. The good news is whether we like Brissett, Jackson Dart, or any of these other like really cheap guys, there isn't anyone who's going to be 20% or 25%, or at least I don't think there's going to be. So we can kind of pick our favorites among this group as long as there's somebody that we have some real conviction about.
Yeah, and we talk about, the name of the show, Leverage Lane, and we talk about leverage levels. We always talk about this. I love that, we think so much alike on stuff, and that's why it's great, because you said, which is smart, and I was going to say, like, I get it, and I think people get it. Like, that is how you get there, because then to my boy Nades, his point says it's a comfortable build. People say, well, at least if it lines up with the stack, I'm on the right path, because that's, if the value hits the cheaper value that I'm on, well, it seems risky. At least it's attached and correlated and associated to a stack that's going to give me multiple extra points and correlation that builds up the overall score. But I think the level to it is that your Brissett, Wilson, McBride stack to get JSN in. Yes, it makes sense. Yes, it feels good. Yes, it is smart. To your point, it still at least makes some sense, because Wilson, well, he's a punt and a risk. It gets you McBride, who's popular for good reason, and JSN, who's popular for good reason. It makes your value work. But just remember, if that's the most common version of that, where people are landing, there is levels to the stacks of like, what's the ability within that price of a stack to go and get Mac Jones, Kendrick Bourne, and George Kittle, and maybe still land on CMC. Like, you know what I mean? Like, where, and then people see it. And that's where I think, Alex, when people watch Takedown Breakdown on Mondays, where we review all this stuff, Nades is on there with me, you're on this with me. When we review that stuff, people are always like, how did I not land on that build? It was so easy. But what's in their head is actually, it makes the same amount of sense as everything else I was considering in our previous example of the Brissett one. It's the same thought process. You just didn't go down that path as your lane. So that's the difference, right? And we've seen it work a ton of different weeks. Geno Smith the week with Myers, Tucker, and Bowers. Even though Meyer and Bowers that week didn't come through, Jacoby Myers and Bowers didn't come through, it was Trey Tucker putting up 44. The lane still worked of the thought process of all my other stuff is great and lines up. If I just hit this, you can think beyond the Brissett one. Not saying don't go that route, just saying when you see it, that if you're seeing that be more popular, so are others, you can find the what makes sense stack in a bunch of different stacks on this slate. And that's what's going to be the case of what can get there. Do you have anything else to add when it comes to that? If not, we can talk a little bit more about these running backs, because I think that's where it gets interesting this week.
Yeah, why don't we have the James Cook, Devon Achane discussion? Because if you look around the industry, you're going to see a lot of Achane projected like 25-30%, and James Cook around 10 to 15. And I just don't see that. I actually have Cook where I think is still conservatively projected at 18.1% in single entries, and Achane at 17.9%. So as close as it could possibly be, I am projecting Cook to flip Achane, and it would not surprise me at all if we get to kick off on Sunday, you open the DraftKings app, you're scrolling through ownerships, and Cook is at 25%, Achane is at 15%. Wouldn't surprise me at all. I don't understand the love. For one thing, like, I haven't talked to anyone who's enthusiastic about playing Achane in this matchup. Yes, he projects well, but it's one of those things where, like, I almost feel like projections can be like too mathematical. We talked last week about how Monangai against the Bengals defense, he was projected like 17.5. That was an aggressive one. But if you compared his typical production, or the typical production of what we would expect in that role, and then talked about how much better running backs done against Cincinnati, averaging like 10 more fantasy points per game, it's like the expectation isn't 17.5, it's 24, 25.5. He got that without a touchdown. So this is one of those, I think, with Achane where it's like the opposite. Any mathematical projection model fairly is going to put him 20, 21, 22 DraftKings points, something like that, because of how much he offers in the passing game as well. But I just don't see how he gets too far beyond that, where I really question the ceiling for Achane this week in this matchup. And there is a path to him really kind of underwhelming because this Buffalo defense, number one, they match up really, really well with Miami, especially with no Tyreek Hill. Like teams just want to play too high against them. Buffalo already plays a lot of too high and they play it really well. They haven't been great against the run, but because of that, because of the way that they defend the pass, they can actually commit more resources to the run in this matchup. And again, Achane doesn't project well because of what he can do in the running game. He projects well because of what he does in the passing game. So I just think this is a bad spot. Buffalo also does a really good job of controlling how much the opponent actually has the ball. Teams don't run a lot of plays against them. Miami runs very few plays to begin with. I think this game as a whole is going to be a low play volume type game, and I think Miami's going to get the wrong side of that anyway. Like to me, this is James Cook or no one from this game, and I feel very strongly about that.
Yeah, I'm actually not as opposed. So I agree fully. This is what we talked about pre-show. So now that we went there, I mean, a couple other factors. Again, my guy Nade's coming in with the good ones. If you can't get to Allen, like you said, people are more comfortable with the cheaper quarterbacks because that's where you can find value this week. The value that we just talked about that leaks out from that into the stack where it's like, oh, now I love my lineup as long as this stack does anything. Again, smart, like you said, don't disagree. But that's part of the thought process. Then it's the huge team total. Then it's still the good matchup on paper. The sites that are showing sort of O-line, D-line, or DVP, like all that stuff is going to reflect the Bills side. Interestingly enough, the projection, I don't know what you have for player point projection, but we actually have a slightly higher projection, a bigger, he can get a bigger ceiling, I think, out of Achane because if he catches a bunch more passes and whatnot and missing since Tyreek Hill and all that, the timing that's gone by, I think it's possible. But I think from a projection point, it still shows James Cook. So that's still going to go into the optimizers. So I've heard more people talk about James Cook and Dulcich secondary stack than I've heard people talk about Achane single by himself. So I will say this, it could be James Cook or nothing. But I think for me, I'm still going to be stacking some Josh Allen. And I also think if I was going a secondary stack, well, it's all baked in. Like we talk about, I actually don't mind going to something like Achane and Kincaid. And it's just the Achane. If the ownership does actually flip, like we think it could, it's more that the ownership, I think, comes back some on both, to your point, on the numbers you have. And then if it does come back some and then one pops up, we actually think it's James Cook that does that in your tournament. So I think especially in like single entry, people want to get a piece of the 30-point Bills. That's just where they go. I'd be fine with Kincaid as well at 4,300. He's just sitting there in the middle of a bunch of other stuff, and you don't have to go Achane in that. I just want to bring it up that I think that's an interesting spot to go as well. Let's see.
For me here, I think the last thing I'll say on this is this is just a spot where I think people get really confident in the ownership projection that they're looking at. And this is one where I think we should give the industry credit for how sharp we are as an industry, in that a lot of people are going to look at that ownership projection for James Cook and say, it's hard to stack this game. I don't like who I'm pairing Josh Allen with. I don't like the opposite side, but they are implied for over 30 points. So someone's going to score. It just makes too much sense to go to James Cook. It's a smart play. It would be one of the sharpest plays on the entire slate if his ownership projection around the industry was correct. So because of that, I'm just saying, I think he's going to be another 5 to 10% kind of minimum. He might end up being, 25, 30%. Like I really wouldn't be shocked if we saw that kind of steam from him. So my point is basically just, if you do want to play James Cook, because I still think he's the smartest way to play anyone from this game. If you do want to play him, you just need to understand you're probably playing into more ownership than what you're seeing around the industry.
Yeah, and I will say this too, because somebody just, I think it was Sean who brought it up, said Judkins is an interesting pivot from Chalky Rico. We could stay here because we're still in segment one, just going through some of the positional stuff as we move around. I think we're seeing, what do you have on Judkins right now? I'm curious. I'll start there actually. What do you have on him right now?
I've got 16%. I think that's probably a little bit above industry. Also another guy that I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up 25%, because the matchup with the Jets is obviously good to begin with. And now no Sauce Gardner, no Quinnen Williams. They're probably going to be even worse defensively than they've been, which is hard to imagine. But like the matchup with Miami, we know Judkins, like Dowdle, is going to be a very game script matchup dependent type fantasy producer. And this definitely qualifies as one of the games where he's most likely to be in a good game script and most likely to actually be efficient, even though they can't pass the ball. So this is a very good spot for Judkins. And again, it's the type of spot that people are going to catch on to and say, hey, wait a minute. this is actually one of the spots where I can play this guy, and he's fun to watch. So it wouldn't surprise me if he ends up 25-30%, but I'm kind of conservatively leaving him at 16 for now.
And I think another thing to talk about here, so I wanted to ask you that. I think he's also going to get boosted by the Browns D. Whether people like it or not, that's a correlation that people love to go with. Obviously, it can make some sense. The chat's already talking about what about putting the Panthers with Dowdle? What about putting the Bills with James Cook? I mean, the Bills with James Cook is a little bit more expensive than the Dowdle cost because you're going up $1,100 or $1,200 and then a little bit on the defense too. So of course that's going to be a little bit lower owned, but at least to Alex's point, that could make some more sense. If it's not Achane, it's not Tua, Tua starts throwing interceptions, things like that. That could be where James Cook finds his way, and you'll just have to find that little bit of extra money. I think the Browns D is definitely pushing up Judkins even further. People are already looking for a bit of a pivot. That doesn't mean that Dowdle doesn't become the highest owned still, which we think he will. It just means it'll be held in check at 40-ish as opposed to getting even crazier and out of control like something else. So I think that's important to think about. And then also
real quick, Tambo, but before you move on, I think this is a phenomenal point that you're making about the Browns and how it affects Judkins. I already have the Browns way above industry. I'm at 16% on them. So I think like immediately when we get off this, I'm going and bumping the Judkins ownership at least to 20%, because this is how we should be thinking through ownership, right? It's not how is everyone evaluating this play individually. It's how does this play get affected by everything else that people are seeing and wanting to do. And like you, I am envisioning a lot of Cleveland defensive steam because there just aren't very many good options. They're under $3,000. They do project pretty well around the industry. And now you have that perfect, traditional correlation pair that you can use them with Judkins. I think it's just a great example of, number one, how we want to kind of show people how to think through ownership and how ownership might move. But then it's also just a really good point and to say that, you know what, I do need to bump that Judkins ownership projection. I think 20 is probably a floor for him. Yeah,
this is the prep work that's important because this is what it makes you actually be ready to go for certain situational stuff when you're thinking. And I'll give another. I love just riffing back and forth on this stuff. It's great because it's, I think it really helps people. But this is a prime example where sometimes this is the case and sometimes it's something else. And I'll give two of them. One is if you go to the spot of like the Carolina one with Dowdle, that's another thing. Like, I don't think you're getting sneaky with the Carolina Panthers D. I think they'll end up becoming one of the most popular cheap defenses because it's backwards correlated. If Dowdle's going to get that much ownership, people start thinking, I can put this in to help it get different. They don't move from Dowdle. They try and go to a different way with it. Dowdle stays, whatever. And then the defense comes along with it. It's the inverse of the one we just talked about, the Browns D picking up steam and that. But it doesn't always get thought about this way where you go to the Cook one because everyone doesn't necessarily currently think. We literally are probably the first people to bring that up. I haven't heard anyone mention it yet, but you and I both thought it, where James Cook is going to be more owned than Achane. You already have a situation where not everyone is there yet. It's a bubble thing. So then the Bills D is not there yet because of that. And if people catch on too late to that and that becomes a great option, that would be your leverage to the tournament in a good way already, if that holds true. Now, just noting that, the secondary piece, and this can be some of the stuff at wide receiver, because I want to talk quickly about like Puka and Amon-Ra and Jefferson and some of these guys, but a favorite of yours, I mean, he probably still is, but week one was not too good to you. Nico Collins, the Jags D is super popular right now at the cheaper price one of 2,600, but you don't see anything on anything that can hurt it or leverage it. And when people, am I going to put him with Travis Etienne Jr.? Probably not. That might not be the way. You don't have to apply the Judkins theory to this, but what would be a way to leverage it is a guy at $6,700 in Nico Collins. I know it's Davis Mills coming in, but still $6,700 for Nico Collins at like 3 to 5% ownership maybe. And that would just, again, anyone who, it's not about, it would necessarily hurt the Jags D. They both could get there. It's most people building lineups with the Jags D already won't have Collins. And then you factor all the other factors of the slate and the position, the stacks and all of that. So do you have any thoughts on any other ways along those lines? Because I think that leads us into some wide receiver talk with Nico Collins as well. But I just think that's something interesting that stands out to me from the previous conversations we just had at running back.
Well, I think there are two things I want to kind of mention here. The first is about this thought of Dowdle and the Carolina defense. I do think it's true that the Carolina defense will stay, 5, 7, 8%, something like that. But think about the ownership within Dowdle lineups. Who's actually using that Carolina defense? Who's paying $3,500 for the Carolina defense? It's primarily the people who have Dowdle and think that they're, getting this great correlation there. I don't think it's that correlated, but more importantly, I think in Dowdle lineups, the Carolina defense might be 15% owned instead of 6%. So you should think about that aspect of it. But then the second thing I want to say is, like, just generally speaking, this is where ownership matters the most. Let's use this Cleveland pair again to kind of really kind of envision this. Judkins, we think, is going to be, let's say, 20%, Cleveland 15%. If you think that you're playing that pair with Judkins at 13% and the Cleveland defense at 7%, because that's what you're seeing on a lot of different sites, you're going to feel really good about that. Ownership doesn't matter a ton when you're looking at, a random wide receiver and it's, is it going to be 8% or 11%? That doesn't really affect a whole lot. 7% and 13% for Judkins and Cleveland versus 20% and 15%. That's massive. That's a huge difference. So when you're looking at these plays, and particularly when you're looking at your contrarian plays, one of the questions you want to ask is, if I'm wrong about the ownership, how wrong can I possibly be about this guy? How protected is this guy from really steaming? Or how protected is this combination from really steaming? And this Cleveland one is one of those examples where you're not protected at all. It could get really bad really quickly. And then you've got to ask yourself, if I am accidentally playing these guys at 20% and 15%, am I going to hate myself for that? And to me, like, that pairing, yeah, that's one that I would not want to be in on that as chalk, as much as I would be interested in it if it's, a contrarian pairing and each of the individual plays there are contrarian. So I think that's just another, like, really good kind of broad picture kind of thought.
Yeah, it's important to think of that. That's what I'm saying. So I love going through this stuff. I would not do this personally, just to note the reason. I mean, we focus on single entry and GPPs, but I mean, you're missing out on so much. And if that's what costs you, imagine you get everything else right. That's the point of having 50 lineups binking. So, I mean, you're missing out on Detroit. You're missing out on Seattle. These are high leverage spots or good cases. Like Seattle is $100 more going up against Brissett and Trey McBride. Both are going to be very popular. If you end up having a good lineup that wasn't on the Brissett stuff already, I mean, when you're on a different stack and everything else that goes with it, you're kind of saying, whether you know it or like it or not, you're saying, I'm not interested in them because I'm interested in this. Beating that, well, what could also help beat that and double leverage it would be to have something like the Seahawks defense. I'm not advocating them specifically as much as saying examples to what you're mentioning within your portfolio. I would not be all in on a $3,500 Panthers just because you like the spot and think it's the best one. To each your own. That's your risk versus reward, your money. But you're going to be really angry if you have 30 or 20 of those builds that are in pretty good shape, but they're all dead because the Carolina D didn't come through for you and easily could have been other alternate options on this slate. So your call, but it's just my 2 cents on it. Lastly, real quick, Alex, and then we'll get to the common build and putting this all together of what we've seen so far. I do want to spend a few moments on those wide receivers because that's I think part of the slate dynamics here, right? Is like you only have these mid-range as low as these mid-range running backs for most people. They're not seeing the option to go to value. You have the cheaper quarterbacks that I think you nailed earlier. People are definitely going to more, to Nade's point, to your point of how comfortable it is and makes sense. But remember, a lot of those not many of those lead to expensive stacks. Maybe you could say the McCarthy, Jefferson, Addison one gets a bit up there, but that still fits the mid-range build of just a cheap tight end with the mid-range running backs and a cheap defense. So it's still a very similar build type once you go down that path. But I do think with Nico Collins and up, like when you go Nico, Puka, Amon-Ra St. Brown, we talked about Jefferson already and maybe in those stacks. Well, what's your thought on these expensive wide receivers on the slate? Because I think that's where people have the struggle to get to. If they're going high, they're going to CMC, for example.
Yeah. So from an ownership perspective, I've got Puka at 23, JSN at 25, Amon-Ra at 20, Jefferson at 10, Ibuka at 15. So I think it's going to be pretty spread out. My preference is not as spread out. I think Puka is in a tier of his own here. I think, number one, he's been kind of in a tier of his own just throughout the whole season, particularly in games that he's played the whole game. But, man, the matchup is so good. In the last 2 weeks, so no Fred Warner for San Francisco, opposing quarterbacks are 19 of 22 for 200 yards and 2 touchdowns throwing over the middle of the field. That's not an accident. That's what happens when you lose a player like Fred Warner on a defense that's already kind of hurting everywhere and isn't that good anyway. And then you realize, who were those quarterbacks? It was CJ Stroud throwing to a team without Nico Collins and Jackson Dart. Stafford to Puka is going to tear them apart this week. I think Puka has an absolutely massive ceiling. I think Kyron Williams has a massive ceiling. This is the game that Kyron had I think it was like 7 receptions for 66 yards and 2 receiving touchdowns. They were using him over the middle field a lot. That was when Fred Warner was still playing. So that whole Rams offense, I think, is in such a good spot. And it really puts Puka ahead of everyone else for me. I also think Devontae Adams, he's produced over the middle quite a bit as well. So I wouldn't count him out. And I think you could play both of them together with Stafford. I wouldn't play them together without Stafford, but I think you could play Adams instead of Puka and feel pretty good about that. So I really like Puka. I really like Adams. And I think they're kind of in a tier of their own for me up top. I don't think the JSN is a bad play. I don't think Amon-Ra is a bad play. I just think Puka is a better play than those guys.
Yeah, the tricky here is, and Nades says it here, that no one wants Stafford at that price point. I don't think it's nobody wants it. I think, ownership explains that, yes, and I agree with you there. But I'm saying that it's a product of the slate. Because if you go even, like, what are you going to do? If you go Stafford and Puka, do you really want to just put Jawan Jennings in there and be like, well, that's my stack? You're leaving out Adams. You're leaving out Christian McCaffrey. Like, you're really not on the best pieces. And it's super expensive to go Stafford, Puka, CMC, and people just cannot find the value, right? They can't find it. So while it does slice into them, and I love a good slice and dice, it's very tricky for people to find that this week unless more value opens up. Because go build a lineup right now and you put Puka, you put Stafford, you put CMC, and then even just do that and build it out. You're not going to like the rest of your build. It's not going to really play out too well when you're looking at sims and things like that. You're going to have to do more. So I think that's part of the process there that people don't fully always follow or see it that way. That's what we try and explain both ways on the show of like, that makes perfect sense and looks good and would be awesome if we could get to it. But when it screws up the rest of the build, that's where people come back and say, what did I do wrong? Well, you jammed like 4 punt plays just to make those 3 guys work. I get it. We like those 3 guys, but we play a 9 roster position game, including defense. So it's like, you have to be able to fill out the rest of the lineup and not have yourself give up too much or need too many diamonds in the rough or sacrifices to get there. And then on the flip side of it, it's the opposite. People go way too safe, right? And they just get all the best plays, but they're all the chalk plays together. And it's like, they're not really going off the board. So I don't know if you have anything else you want to add on that, but if not, that's probably a good segue after you're done to bring us to the how to leverage the common build this week and what we're seeing that look like. I think we talked through a bunch of it already.
I think the one thing I'll add to that thought is if I was going to do the Stafford double stack, or if I was going to use Stafford at all, it would be a double stack with Puka and Adams, and then the bring back to save money instead of trying to force McCaffrey. I don't even think you could possibly do that. I'd go Kittle. And it gets to just this idea of like, we want to think about how the game could go. If Stafford and Puka and Adams are connecting, they're going for a touchdown drive every single time they touch the ball, and Stafford's throwing all these touchdowns, it's putting San Francisco in a game script where they actually have to just traditionally drop back, throw regular passes, get away from the run game, get away from the play action game. And now you're actually getting Kittle running routes every play instead of being used as a blocker, this and that. And that's when Kittle all of a sudden has, the path to an 8 reception game. And so I think that's another thing I think of. And just like, again, just this idea of when you're stacking, when you're building any lineup, you want to think, how does this affect each individual play? That's a kind of game script where Kittle would really have that massive ceiling. So I like that thought. But yeah, let's move on to kind of leveraging the common build and what the common build actually is.
Yeah, no spoilers. Let's move on for sure. We'll keep it rolling. We got our leverage lane at the end, but we'll talk through that. I think this is definitely an interesting spot. I'll say that much. Let's go to the second part. The second segment for those that are tuning in for the first time. We appreciate you. Make sure to hit that thumbs up. Make sure to subscribe. If you like this content, it's free. This is a show a lot of people would love to have behind the paywall instead of out in the open, but we have a lot of fun doing it. We get a ton of people getting involved. And remember, I know everyone right now is watching this live, but if you are watching this on playback or replay, as many do, put your leverage lane in the comments below. Let us know what you're on. We'll circle back each week and take a look at some of those before we go into the show. But that's going to be a new thing moving forward. Just make sure you put that down there. So let us know yours. Going to the second segment there, Alex, how to leverage the common build. Really just looking at sort of now that we've seen everything we've seen, we want to put it all together, see what some of these combinations are. The Judkins Browns one was a prime example. Like, that's certainly going to be a popular one that you see paired up. We talked about a few different ones already, but then we could talk about some of these game stacks as well. So let's talk about the common build first, what you're seeing to round out segment 1, and then we'll talk about how we can leverage that.
So yeah, I think the first thing that I'm seeing in terms of the common build is not the expensive quarterback, it's the cheap quarterback. Trying to save some money in the stack so that you can get at least two kind of studs. And when I say studs, I don't necessarily mean McCaffrey Puka. I'm also including Cook, Gibbs, maybe even like a Derrick Henry type guy, or Justin Jefferson, Devontae Adams, Emeka Ibuka. I think all these guys kind of qualify here because it's just someone commented earlier, it's a more comfortable build this way. If you save money through the stack, now you're getting access to these guys that you view as some really high upside great plays, and you're doing it without having to punt anywhere in a way that feels like, oh, this is a really ugly play, but at least I get access to this guy. If you do that through the stack instead, if you save your money through the stack, whether it's Brissett, McBride, Michael Wilson, as you said, whether it's Brissett, Marvin Harrison, and Michael Wilson, or Marvin Harrison and Trey McBride, I think it's going to be just a much more comfortable way for people to build. And that means if we want to leverage these builds, what do we have to do? Well, we either have to find a better way to play the studs. So, I think the best answer is find the cheap stack that you think is just a better cheap stack than what people are using. Because if you're going the route instead of, I'm going to use these studs and I'm going to now, instead of, saving money through my stack, I'm going to save money with a bunch of really cheap one-offs. That's a decidedly worse path than the cheap, well-correlated stack. So instead, I want to find the contrarian, well-correlated cheap stack that I think is just better than where most people are going. Or I want to just build a very balanced lineup. And instead of getting to CMC and JSN, I say, okay, what if the most expensive guy in my lineup is Devontae Adams or Derrick Henry, something like that. And now I'm getting a bunch of guys who I like, a bunch of guys who I think have a great ceiling. Rico Dowdle would fit that mold. But I don't have to punt anywhere. I don't have to save money anywhere. My stack is probably going to be a mid-tier stack as well. So those are the two routes for me. Very balanced build or a contrarian cheap stack.
Yeah, and we'll look at some of those. I think the big thing for me is looking at some of the spots. It's like if you're on Dowdle, fine, but if you're not, I would be comfortable playing Saints D at 2,400. We just saw a cheap D get there last week that was against Kimani Vidal and the popular defense on the other side. You could see something like that this week. If you didn't want to go that route, I think another one, somebody mentioned it earlier, but was like you could definitely flip the Browns side. I know the Jets are in shambles and everyone says they suck now and da-da-da. They're still, I think last I looked, they were still favorites, or maybe they moved to slight underdogs. No, yeah, slight underdogs, what they moved to. So they, at the end of the day, I think you could see that stuff flip. We've seen teams, like, look at the stuff we've seen lately. We've seen Carolina beat Green Bay. We've seen, all these teams show up in these spots where it's like, it's definitely possible. And that's just two bad teams. So it could go either way. But what game stack do you think people are going to end up on the most? And then what are sort of the fallbacks to the secondary and third? Like if they're not on that game stack, where's the next one going to be? Because it may be like part of the common build where you see people landing, but I'm still hearing a lot of people talk about the Brissett side of that Seahawks game and the Darnold side of that game as well. So I'm wondering if that's the one where you could just see a little bit of a breakdown. I mean, I'll build for that in some, but in like my single entry, I think that's one I'm going to not go to when we get to leverage lane. I think it's going to be something different.
Yeah, I think people are going to go to that game for sure. I think people are going to use JJ McCarthy as well with Minnesota and just kind of flip that a little bit. And I think that's an interesting one, because even though you're using a $4,900 quarterback, it's not necessarily a cheap stack as long as you're going to Justin Jefferson. But it's very similar to the Arizona stack in that way, right? Like if you're using Brissett, you're probably using JSN as one of your payups. Same idea here. You're still, building this kind of lineup that says, okay, I'm going to try to get to two studs, but one of them is now just included in the stack. So maybe it would be something like McCarthy, Jefferson, Addison, and Flowers, or maybe you even use Mark Andrews as the bring back. Personally, I don't like that. I think you made this point on the show with Pat, but when Mark Andrews gets there, he's scoring touchdowns. So I like Flowers more as a bring back than I like Andrews, but you get the idea, right? Like you're going to McCarthy to save a lot of money at that one quarterback spot so that you can still get access to a lot of these studs, and you're just now using the studs in a correlated way. as well. So I think that'll be used quite a bit. The one game that I expected to be crazy popular that doesn't seem to be that popular is Chicago and New York. I thought that would be like a massively popular game, and I was actually projecting it that way prior to the update that I did this morning, because I'm just not seeing the signs of people really liking that game. I honestly think that part of that, though, is people looked at ownership for the first time this week. They saw, oh my God, Wan'Dale Robinson's at 20% again. I'm not doing that, right? Like they just did that last week. Wan'Dale did not really come through. Dart had a fine game, but they don't want to go back to that thought. It looks like Komet's going to play, so it's a little bit harder to figure out how to stack Caleb Williams. Rome is coming off such an awful game, so I think people were turned off to that game when they saw ownership there. Now that around the industry, you're not seeing a whole lot of ownership on that game, and I'm not seeing like the signs of interest that I was expecting to see from that game. Maybe people will actually start to like it again and it'll get some buzz again, but that to me is probably like the clear and obvious pivot at the moment. I'm not sure if there are too many other really cheap options. I think you can do some really cheap stuff with Drake May stacks. He's not the cheapest, but if you're going, Pop Douglas and Hunter Henry as your two, that makes it really cheap. Or even if you're going May, Diggs, Hunter Henry, that probably qualifies more as like the mid-tier type stack that we talked about, where you're not necessarily saving a ton of money in any one spot, but you're also not spending in any one spot in that stack. So that would be a really good way to build a lineup that, has only one stud or has nobody over $7,500, something like that. So that one also could get some ownership. But I think the theme of the week, honestly, is that there isn't like a super common stack. It's a structure that's going to be common, but there isn't one that people are going with. So if you have one that you have a lot of conviction on, I think you can play it however you want.
Yeah, I want to say it's definitely the weather that's throwing people off this. So right now, the current projection for that game is 25 to 30 mile per hour winds with potential for rain and snow. Again, it's Chicago, much like, in Philly, all these in New York, all these places. I'm in Canada. It's no different here. The weather can say one thing today and be something totally different tomorrow. That would definitely be something, but the chat's got onto it here too, talking about the weather scaring people off. My man Jonesy just on an absolute heater over at The Nation says 90% chance of snow for Chicago game again. And if that's the case, that's going to be part of it as well. But I definitely think that's part of what scared people off. I'll think about it as I go through before we get to the other stuff, but just to kind of give a couple spots. One is game by game quickly, like on the Panthers side, Tet McMillan popped up on the injury report. Now, if he's out, I think there's already, if you're starved for value, an option the chat mentioned that I've been on a little bit thinking about him the last couple of weeks, but Jalen Coker is 3,300. He would already be a leverage play as an option there if you weren't on Dowdle. And if you want value to make something work, it's thin, but just of note, obviously it would get a lot nicer, a little bit better if Tet was out, and you'd feel good about just sort of landing there if you landed there. At least I would. So I'll note that. The other thing is Swift with the personal issue. It was like thinking he's coming back, the questionable tag. Now it looks a little more murky. I was already interested in this, and it may pick up steam by Sunday because people are starved for value, but I like that he's 5,600 is Monangai off last week. This is another great matchup. Snow, rain, don't care. Why not just run the guy into the ground right now at 5,600? I think he becomes a spot to go to here on this slate, especially if we get the Swift news in that game. I think he would fit no matter what. Talked about Collins already. I'll move quicker, but Collins against the Jags D, just Collins in general, 6,700 is a fair price. We already had a good enough conversation, I think, around the Bills Dolphins. The one thing I did want to bring up, though, back to the JJ McCarthy and the game stack factor there is, can they push the Ravens? That's what it always comes down to. We've had these conversations in the past. You need a team that can be able to do it. And I think they can. We just saw it last week against Detroit where they could do it. They do have Addison. They have Jefferson. They have Hawkinson. They've got a running game there that they can move around and do some stuff with. So a fair team total. I'm not saying we're going to see the JJ from last week because I didn't have much faith in him then. But the thing about this stack is as much as Jefferson is 7,900, McCarthy, 49. Opposite of Lamar, who's expensive. And not really, it's too cheap for these quarterback prices, but they left all the players this way this week. Addison only 54. And one of the most interesting things of this is it's probably the better matchup anyway, if you are going against Minnesota, is to get there on the ground. We had interest in Gibbs. We had interest in Montgomery. People were looking at those options last week. I say we as an industry, people were looking at these spots. And now you get Derrick Henry at 6,800. It's not that far off from like a Dowdle or something like that, but I want to put him in a way, and you can play him with Dowdle too, but I'm saying I want to put him in a way that makes sense. Well, what gets this game rolling is him on the ground early, and then it's McCarthy needing to keep pace and throw it back and forth. It would also affect it further if you left Zay out, who is 30% or whatever he ends up being, 20 to 30%, whatever he comes in at in your tournament. So I think those are some more interesting ones. We talked about the Browns Jets already. We talked about Drake May a little bit. I think the Drake May one, just people have a hard time stacking him. And because if it's not Booty, who's now out this week, it really, though, it did get kind of thinner. So you mentioned him quickly there, Alex, but like if you're stacking them up, you have Diggs, Mayo like Pop Douglas. You've got Henry, who looks like he's popular, but the one I always use, there's 100 people in the room and 90 of them are leaving the room to not play Hunter Henry. So it's not like he's that popular. People like to call everything chalk. 10% wouldn't be that bad. Do you have any thoughts? I guess my question would be, on the other side of that game, I do think the total's big enough. I think the spot's possible to really bad pass defenses on paper, but do you have any other thoughts on the Tampa Bay side of this game to make Drake May move?
So real quick, I actually have Hunter Henry at 20.5%. So it'd be 80% of the room leaving, not 90, but
I would take the under on that. And one we tend to agree, but I don't. Again, people need value, so I get where it's coming from. But part of these people going to their comfortable stacks, I think, always leads to a moonwalk, and I think that could be the case with Henry. But I'll give you like 15 to 20, so that's fine. Even continue on.
Yeah, that's definitely possible. On the Tampa side, like I think Ibuka might come in a little bit lower than people expect, just because the matchup is not good. Like I made this point in my Discord, but on the year, the New England pass defense, their numbers still look pretty bad. But Christian Gonzalez was out for the first 3 weeks. Since he came back, they are number 2 in pass DVOA. So this is a much, much, much better pass defense than their season-long numbers look, because they were just that bad for the first 3 weeks before their superstar corner came back. We just saw Drake London do really, really well against them, so maybe that affects things. But as good as Ibuka is, he's not Drake London. Drake London is outstanding, and he made a lot of like outstanding contested catches, which is not Ibuka's game, at least at this point in his career yet. So I think it's a really bad spot for him. I think most people are going to kind of agree and just think, you know what, he's too close to Jefferson and St. Brown. If I'm going to pay $7,000 for Ibuka, I can find the 1,000 to get to one of those guys. So that's kind of how I see that. But that does make him a pretty good option as a bring back to any May stuff. And I do think like you could go to Tez Johnson, I think it's going to be like 10%. You could go to Rashad White and just hope he scores multiple touchdowns, even though that's pretty ugly. Like they can't run the ball against anyone. They're definitely not going to be able to run the ball against New England. So you're just hoping that Rashad gets there on touchdowns and receiving stuff. But yeah, I don't think any of that's necessarily bad or wrong to do. It's an interesting game because we know that people are going to think of that game like it's two of the biggest pass funnels in the league, right? Like both of those run defenses are really good, and both run offenses are really bad. We should expect a lot of dropbacks in that game. So from just a pure game environment perspective, it is really, really interesting. And I think a lot of people are going to have that thought and still not land on it because they don't know how to stack it. They don't know how to play it. They don't have any conviction on any of the individual players, even though they agree conceptually that it's a good spot for everyone in the game.
One thing I do like, if Henry got to that ownership because he makes it cheaper, is potentially going with something like people were calling this guy the MVP before. If you go to Baker, Ibuka, Tez, run it back with Henry, you could still get again, that's where I'm saying when it hits, someone's like, oh, I had all those other right pieces. I just didn't land on that stack. It's like, oh, I wasn't going to play that loser chalk Henry, but it's not who you play. It's how you play them. That would make some sense. And then you don't have to try and figure out the other side, even though May's fine. It's more, we know May or Baker could push the other. So if you like the Drake May side better, I'm talking to people out there watching, by all means, go to that. If that's the whole point of leverage lane. If that's your lane, go to it. This is not my lane, but just making a note and thinking about it. I don't see anywhere in the world Ibuka can get ownership on this slate. Yet I do think it's a pretty good spot. You look at the props, you look at the matchup, you look at the capability of, can this game be pushed? It can. And neither side, you can't really run in this spot. And I'll tell you what, the Patriots don't seem to want to run anyway, because they still can't get this guy. We've been trying to make Henderson work for weeks now. It just doesn't seem to be a thing. So that one's somewhat interesting just from that perspective. The other thing is too, Alex, as we round it out here, It's the last 3 games on the slate, kind of like the way we're doing it today. These all have very high interest in many ways, and there's definitely going to be late swap. There's always late swap. I shouldn't say it like that, like it's some revolutionary thing. But mind you, most people don't do it at all. So, I'm guarantee you that too. But this is a really interesting, even an afternoon only slate when you have Brissett, Darnold, Stafford, Mac Jones, Goff, and Mariota. These are all starting points for people. There's all good game environments. What do we got? All 20, 30, like we've got pretty much 47 and up for game totals on all 3 of these games. So I guess the one spot we didn't spend a lot of time on outside of a little bit of mentioning of Amon-Ra is the Lions spot. We did spend a lot of time on Rams 49ers. We've definitely spent time on Cardinals Seahawks. Do you want to finish out just talking a little bit about this Detroit spot, 30-point team total, implied team total at home? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is a game where I think the prevailing narrative around the industry is this is one of those spots where Detroit could run up the score, right? It's a rematch of the playoff game that they lost. They're coming off one of their most underwhelming games of the last few years, and Washington kind of stinks across the board now, particularly no Jaden, no Terry. Like, this Detroit defense should have a field day, and offensively they can probably do whatever they want here. And so I'm thinking of this in a couple ways. Like, one, I think you can absolutely go with Goff triples. You could go Goff, St. Brown, Jameson Williams, Sam Laporta, and hope he throws one of those 5 touchdown games. That's I think a really good way to build this out. I also think Jahmyr Gibbs might slip through the cracks, and he might be 10% when McCaffrey, Cook, Achane, Henry, Judkins, Dowdle are all, soaking up so much ownership around him. And is there a better spot for a running back on this slate than Gibbs against Washington? Throw last week out the window. Flores had a blitzing plan that forced Gibbs and Montgomery to be pass blockers every drop back instead of being able to run routes. And they ended up trusting Montgomery a little bit more in that role. That's not going to affect who's on the field this week. We've seen Gibbs, even in a shared role, put up 39.8 against Tampa. That's the Tampa run defense. We're talking about Washington. He has a massive, massive ceiling here. If I think he's going to slip into like 7%, 8%, I'm going to play him, just point blank period. If I think he's going to be single digits, I'm going to play him. But I think it's also one of those spots where, like, maybe you put Amon-Ra St. Brown in your flex, and if you need to get a little bit more contrarian with late swap, you swap him to Gibbs or something like that. But yeah, it's a really kind of incredible spot for the whole offense. And I do think it's going to be played a little bit more than ownership suggests. Like, I have Jameson Williams coming in over 10%. I think most people think he's going to be 7%, 8%, something like that. Laporta, I think, is going to be a little bit higher than people expect. But Gibbs, to me, is the one that might actually slip through the cracks and be less owned than people expect, as people opt instead to go attack that passing game.
Yeah, one thing I love this week too, again, is clearly and currently starved for value, like we said. So one of the common things I'm seeing that this is a double whammy. It's, first of all, when you've already got CMC, who's $1,000 more, less people like Gibbs, really triple whammy. Less people like Gibbs for that reason. Gibbs failed everybody last week. And even the people that believe what we believe, the chat doesn't always believe, but even the people believe that we believe that the Lions could come back with a chip on their shoulder and just smash this Jaden Daniels-less Commanders team now and be able to get after it. They kind of want Montgomery because it's like, oh, if I can just get a 5K running back, he at least can get something there. So it leads to 10 or 11% Gibbs in a great spot after everybody loved him this week. The matchup's phenomenal. If they're actually going to be up, it might get even better. The guy's electric with the ball in hand. He's 1,000. Think of him as 1,000 less than McCaffrey in those builds. And you think about ways to use that to your advantage. So I think the Detroit spot's really good. I'm going to be mixing it up a ton. I've talked about this also a ton in the past while everybody else tries to figure out cornerback versus wide receiver and this, that, and the other, and all these things. I just, that's not my lane. That's not my stuff when it comes to DFS. I want to focus on the game and playing it. And I think for single entry, I've got a different spot that I'm going to go, but it may include this spot to what we just mentioned. But I will definitely have some Goff. I thought about this for my leverage lane. We're going to get there in a second, but I thought about like Goff, Amon-Ra, Jameson, Laporta, no run back, and honestly, maybe even putting the Lions D and just going full onslaught. I've done this in the past in single entry or higher dollar, smaller field stuff. You can really get away with that if you think they're just going to pop 40 points on them and just crush. That could be a way to do it. You don't need to run it back. You can shorten it. You can do whatever you want as far as the sack size goes here. But I definitely think there's just a chance that the Lions just crush and score a ton of points, and I'm going to want to be involved if that happens. So I think that's kind of it, man, on everything else. If people think we missed stuff, by all means, can hit us up in the chat if you want to go through more. But do you have anything else, Alex, before we get to our lane?
I do not.
All right, I'll let you start it off, man. I don't think we're on the same one at all, so I'll let you go ahead first.
Yeah, I wasn't entirely sure which one I was going to go with. I think there's a very good chance that the thing I end up feeling the strongest about is dart stacks. I'd like to see how the weather report looks. I'm very rarely kind of turned off by weather. The combination, though, of snow and wind, or rain and wind, that's where I do think you get a little bit dicey. So if one of the two kind of doesn't look that way come Sunday, whether it's the wind is actually laying down even though it's going to rain or snow a little bit, or it's going to be windy but there's no precipitation anymore, I think that's where I'll end up going. But my leverage lane is going to be kind of a very contrarian thought, which is to pair Puka Nacua with Kyren Williams. Obviously, most people are going to just kind of choose their favorite Ram if they really like this game, but I think this sets up as one of those games where the Rams offense is going to be able to do whatever they want every single possession. You're going to see chunk play after chunk play to Puka. You're going to see a lot of touchdown equity for Kyren Williams. I think we could get something like, 12 for 150 and a score from Puka, and combine that with a 100-yard bonus and 2 or 3 touchdowns for Kyren Williams. I think they both have a path to a ceiling together, and I just want to be on this offense in a big way. But we talked through earlier how difficult it is to actually pull off a Stafford double stack. So if I'm not going to try the Stafford double, how do I go all in on this offense? I pair a running back with a receiver. Stafford's not going to get there if Kyren scores multiple touchdowns, but that offense could very easily still score 5 touchdowns total. And if I get 3 or 4 of those from this Puka and Kyren combination, and they both hit the 100-yard bonus, you're gonna see both of them in optimal lineups. So I think that's gonna be my leverage lane. It's the combo of Puka and Kyren. Let them go nuts.
Yeah, one very thing. I mean, I'm not picking on Binking today. He's in here. We appreciate all the engagement, but one of the biggest leaks and misconceptions in people in DFS is the score, meaning the points. Obviously, the higher the score you can have, the more points that are out there. But in a 24-19, you could have 3 optimal plays from that game. It's all who scores the points. So to his point, what if the 24 is the Rams and it's a touchdown, 10 catches, and 170 for Puka, and it's 2 touchdowns from Williams on the ground? That's 2 options right there, and that's not even at 24 points. That's the 3 touchdowns, and then there's a field goal in there. So just to throw that out there, the score doesn't always matter when it comes to the actual output of the lineup. I think that's a big mistake. A lot of people, or this Bears team sucks. They only got a 19-point team total, and then DJ Moore catches 10 catches, 100 yards, a touchdown, and throws a touchdown. And it's like, wow, they only put up 2 touchdowns, but he was in on both of them. And that's part of the thought process. So you can get there in these spots still. That's of note. Anything you want to add?
I also just don't agree that the game's going under. Maybe it goes under because San Francisco doesn't produce, but give me the overall day on the Los Angeles team total. Like I said, 19 of 22, 200 yards and 2 touchdowns, just attacking the middle of the field in the last 2 games. That's a Nico Collins-less CJ Stroud and Jackson Dart. Stafford and this offense, I think, is going to absolutely shred them. It just posts like an absolutely massive success rate, some explosives, but they don't even need the explosives, right? And if they don't get the explosives, that makes it even more likely that 2 of these guys hit together, because it means you get a Puka 20-yard reception, and now a Kyren 8-yard run, now a Puka 12-yard reception, now a Kyren 8-yard reception, and they just stack the points on top of each other, and they get the touchdown. So I love them together, and I just love attacking that game in whatever way we can.
Me too. And that's why I was hoping you would just stop after you said the dart stuff, because you leaked in a little bit to mine, but it is different. So I'm going to go heavy on mine again this week. I'll put 4 pieces to it in just a second. But one thing I want to note, actually very interesting, because you did bring up the dart stuff, is the Vegas total does not have any fear of the weather either as of yet. To me, what I'm seeing, if you go look at some of these Vegas odds and insider stuff, it actually looks like the total has rose from 43.5 open, which is just an opening line, but it's up to 47 now for that line. So, I mean, like, it doesn't seem like they're very scared of the weather in this spot. So at least that's something to keep in mind.
I think part of that, by the way, is because the Giants' run defense is like totally inept. So even if there's bad weather, Chicago at the very least should be able to move the ball and score. I don't want to say anything else on that because I'm afraid it might be your leverage lane, but
It's not. Just want to note it for you because you brought up the dart stuff, and I like that.
Yeah, I do think just like in general, whether we think it's Monangai or whether we think it's Swift, I'm very confident that one of those two is going to have a really, really good game. I don't know who's going to run ahead of the other. I don't know who's going to get the touchdowns, but I'm very confident that one of those guys has a really good game. So maybe the move is just like bet the over on the rushing for both of those guys and then not mess with it from a DFS perspective. But if anyone out there, like if you feel like, man, I just don't like the Dowdle chalk, or I don't like the Judkins chalk, or I don't like any running backs in that range, and you want to take a chance on a 6,100 Swift or a 5,600 Monangai, I'm all for it. One of those two is going to have a really good game.
Yeah, one note too is, again, like I said, we still got to wait on the Swift stuff, but right now, my book moved it quite a bit, actually, is Monangai has a 55.5 rush yard prop to the 51.5 for Swift. It converted it already based on the news. Obviously, that's not like rocket science, but they both are. But Swift is still minus 125 to score anytime touchdown, and Monangai is minus 105. So again, an interesting thing would be like you could go pair up the Monangai anytime and the over on the rush yards. It might still happen even if Swift plays, but if he doesn't, you're way ahead of the curve, and that's you taking the bet when they're willing to offer it. So I think that's part of the thought process as well, just in case. And the other thing, I mentioned this last week and it ended up coming true, and I'll say it again, is lots of good team totals and things to look at out there. We always talk about today. We talked about it with Detroit. We're talking about it with the Rams and some of these other teams. But what you have to take note when a team like the Chicago Bears have almost a 28-point team total or something on the road last week in that matchup, again, still sitting there right now with like a 26-27 range when it comes to their team total at home. And again, weather aside, they got to put those points up somehow. So definitely think that's something to consider. But my leverage lane, I'm going to fully commit to this now because I was going to halfway in on this and just get there, and say Puka and Kittle, because I like that Puka cost McCaffrey money. It's really tricky to put them all together. While I would prefer to have McCaffrey, that would be great. Maybe in my MME sets or something, there's some unique versions of that I get where it makes sense. But for my single entry in my leverage lane, I'm going to go to the opposite side. I think for Stafford to have the big game, he's going to need to be pushed. I'm going to go to Mac Jones, George Kittle, Puka Nacua, and I'm going to add the fourth. I guess I'll stop at 3, but I'll say this. There's a high likelihood that I get Jahmyr Gibbs into this lineup as well as the way to sort of put out the Nacua over McCaffrey for big spend while still spending at running back and then finding some value plays across the middle. It's a little bit expensive with Nacua and Gibbs, but when you add in Mac Jones and Kittle, and I'm hoping that Kittle eats the touchdowns up, obviously the point of like my Mark Andrews piece yesterday with Mayo was that like I don't really want him just as a run back because if he gets there, I think it really helps the Lamar side more. So I wouldn't really love that in a JJ McCarthy side. But yeah, I'm going to go with Mac Jones, Puka, George Kittle, and I'll throw Gibbs in there too. Even though he's not in that game, it's not about the game stack. People are wondering what that means. It's because he would be the guy for $1,000 less than McCaffrey. And I really like the Gibbs spot this week when nobody else does after just a great spot last week fell through. I think they're going to come back and find those points. So that's going to be my leverage lane for this week. Final thoughts, Alex, anything you want to add there, and then let the people know where they can find you.
I like that a lot. I think you could also use the double bring back if you wanted, right? Mac Jones, George Kittle, and then go Puka and Kyron and just kind of combine those two leverage lanes. But yeah, you can find me at Alex Blickle 1 on Twitter. All the ownership stuff from FTN, you can use promo code BLICK for 10% off there. And then as I mentioned like last week, we've gotten a ton of people into my Discord from Leverage Lane, from Mastermind, really adding to the community. Everyone who's come in has been awesome. So appreciate all you guys. And if you guys want to continue to kind of see what's up there, promo code LEVERAGE will get you 10% off forever in my Discord.
Yeah, it's awesome, man. It's good stuff. And a lot of stuff that you take that we talk about, you can apply to the props, the pick'ems, the things like that. We've talked about our deal with Splash. If you guys want to get it on Splash, the one and dones are starting to pop up and that sort of thing. So make sure to get the $50 deposit bonus, even if you're not using it till golf comes back or whatever it might be. You want to get in while you can get that bonus. So go to Splash, use code SHIPIT. And then if you want to get in at Ship It Nation for the rest of the season through Super Bowl, it's more than half price to the normal full season. And we still have half the regular season left, plus the playoffs, plus Super Bowl, $199 gets you Ship It Games entry. It includes SaberSim. It gets all the tools, data, the Discord, etc. And then you also get a chance to win a 555 Millie Maker ticket. Alex, this was awesome. Hope everyone appreciates it. Make sure to leave your leverage lane in the comments. Hit that thumbs up while you're there. It helps us out a ton. Make sure to subscribe to the channel. For Alex, for myself, ToeTagginTambo, let's ship it.